The incident that sparked my first interest in radio, as it is now called, it was called wireless then, was the sinking of the Titanic in 1912. We were in a real estate office, my dad and I, in New Westminster, when the news came through on the telegraph, the sinking of the Titanic and all the details. Somehow, the Titanic was able to get a so-called wireless message, which was picked up by several other ships hundreds of miles away and went to her assistance. And how you could send electrical messages through without wires fascinated me. I was determined I was going to find the answer. In the early days, when I was growing up on Savory Island and learning all about radio as it was known then, the BC coast was a unique community of people. They were pioneers from all over the world. But that world and the people I knew has more than just changed. It has all but disappeared. In 1913, my dad built our first tent where we lived for over 10 years, and it was located right down there. Those arbutus trees now were only about 10 feet high, and they were in our front yard, and our garden was there in the tent, and this road has since been built over the site. We lived miles from everywhere else, so I wasn't used to other kids my age. I was used to grown-ups, and particularly my dad, who was a wonderful comrade, and I thought the world of him.
Jim's mother was a character, as sometimes you find that kind in there. She always wore men's clothing.
She loved fishing. She wasn't very keen on cooking, and she didn't do much of a job of it either. She wanted to be the center of attraction at all times, and she was, as far as strangers are concerned. They thought she was wonderful. But she took it out on us when they went around.
His father was a scientist, a Cambridge scholar who'd come to the coast and was really not a practical man, but he had that wonderful English orderly mind. And he instilled that way of thinking in Jim.
I used to get the Montreal Star, and every week there was a section in there about wireless and how to build the simple sets. Finally, I sent away to Montgomery Ward and bought a pair of the best Lakeside headphones. And with that and a Galena crystal and a cat's whisker and winding a lot of bell wire on an oatmeal package, and putting a slider on it, I was able to tune in the ships on Morse code. And one time, close to midnight, when I was tuning for another station, I heard music. I couldn't believe it. And I woke Dad up, and he came and listened, and it was definitely music, and that was where I heard the announcer say that it was KPO San Francisco, Rudy Seeger's orchestra. So the next night, almost everybody on the island came down to listen. And I had an old Boy Scout bugle, and I was able to put the mouthpiece of the bugle on one of the headphones, make a loudspeaker of it, and they all heard it. Well, from then on, I started to get orders to build sets at $25 a throw. I'd send away and get the parts. And I was in business, and I haven't worked since. So I set up shop on Savory, and I painted a large sign and erected it over on Ragged Islands, just outside of Lund, where all the tugboats up and down the coast would read it, advertising my services as a radio expert. And from then on, I had tugs and fish boats coming over, tying up at the wharf while I would repair their radios.
I remember we used to listen to Shreveport, Louisiana, and KPO, San Francisco. And then he got really hooked on it, and he started to build transmitters.
This is the house we built in 1924. My first radio transmitting station was located, that's the window, the corner of it there, and you can see the insulators above the window where my antennas came in. And at the corner of the house, I built a mast, and it was 75 feet high. And from there, I had my ham transmitting antenna. Social life there was limited, excepting for the summer when we used to call them the summer punks, the kids would come up on their holidays. And the kids of my age, we didn't fraternize too much because they were from wealthy families, and they definitely looked down on somebody like myself, and I felt it very much. But this particular one simply knocked me for a loop. I was completely gone on her. And she'd made life difficult for me, and looking back on it now, I think that it was deliberate. She said that her uncle, I shan't name him, but he was a very wealthy and well-known businessman, had told her that he wouldn't agree to her marrying anybody that wasn't making at least $500 a month. Well, that'd be like saying 50,000 nowadays. And I set out, from then on, I left Savory and I went out looking for work, and I was bound I was going to make that $500 a month. So I got my first boat and I went up and down the coast. And that expanded to where I'd cover the whole coast from Seymour Inlet to Vancouver at least once a month. And I'd call at every logging camp and every little outstation, all chasing this $500 that I never made.
The Spilsbury part of the coast was the coast of the little isolated stump ranches, the floating logging camps, the mission boats and the store boats, and the people who are truly isolated.
I would call at literally hundreds of small places and logging camps, building receivers for people that just wanted to listen to the news, mainly, and entertainment like Jack Benny, etc. And for a while, I knew almost every small logging camp and the proprietor and half the people in it. I had many good customers among the Indian communities up and down the coast. And one time at Thurston Bay, in the government station there, they had a whole warehouse full of junk. And among other things, I spotted on the shelf a siren that had been used on a police motorcycle. I guess I stole it, and I mounted it on the wheelhouse of the 5BR. It'd sound like a fire engine coming. And from then on, that identified me. I was the only boat on the coast with a fire siren on board, and they'd say, "There's the radio boat."
Heading up the country 100 miles or so, we had blankets for to travel, biscuits for to chaw. We were in search of pitchbacks way up the Yukon.
I lived full-time on the radio boat for 8 years, including 6 years with my first wife, Glennis. My eldest son spent his first year of life aboard the boat. We turned one stateroom into a workshop, complete with tools, parts, and test equipment. A sort of floating factory. I actually manufactured radio telephones on board. For service work, my charge was 75 cents an hour when I could get it. This was during the Depression. There were a lot of people on the coast, and most of them kept busy. Nobody went hungry. So it was a busy time and a very happy time, and while other people I know suffered through the Depression, I was just getting rolling. I'd never had it so good as the Depression years.
It's amusing to me, those waiters to see as they pass many times to and fro, with a dish in each hand, about all they can man at Buck's Camp down at Monroe. The Loki does fine as she makes the incline, makes it both puff, snort, and blow. It would unman your nerves as she slides round the curves at Buck's Camp down at Monroe.
It wasn't easy doing what Jim Spilsbury did. He had to probably overcome conditions that no other radio repairman on earth had to do, in fighting weather and dealing with transient drunken loggers who didn't pay their bills and that kind of thing. Every radio that he sold was a new triumph for him.
Surgeon Arrows had a lot of people living in there in those days, and the postmaster, Jones was his name, would come down this goat trail and then spend the night sitting on the float because nobody knew when the Union steamship would arrive, within 8 or 10 hours. In the wintertime, in the freight shed there, you'd see him all wrapped up in gunny sacks. So finally, he left a message for me. He wanted to buy a radio. And I showed him something I thought would be suitable. It was quite a small Stuart Warner, very reliable. He said, "You got anything better than that?" The biggest thing I had on board was an enormous console, an RCA console, 8 tubes. That's the one he wanted. And he says, "Now how do I get the steamer?" And I showed him way down at the end of the dial where the steamer broadcast. And he says, "Fine," set it there, and we heard the steamer, leave it. And for 2 years, he never moved that dial. It was only used to listen to the steamer. And this was about $225 sale. For $25, I could have given him a 1-tube set that had done that. There were, for the most part, only one mail steamer a week to most of those places, including Savory Island. It would frequently take 3 weeks to a month for an exchange of letters, and it's hard to carry on a business that way. And that pretty well convinced me I had to have a Vancouver base of operations, even though I was scared to go to the big town myself. I didn't like it. We were competing then with a very active Canadian Marconi company in the same line of business. It was almost what you'd call boom times. We didn't think so at the time. We thought it was here forever and only would get better. Then when gas rationing came in, only fishermen could get it. And for that you had to pay, I think, $5 for a license and put trolling poles up, which I was, I suppose, too proud to do. And so I tied the boat up, and that's when my cousin talked me into buying an airplane, which he said I would be able to get gas for. Cousin Rupert was one of these barnstorming pilots long before the war. His father had money, and he was able to learn to be a flyer, and he wore the tight pants and the leather leggings and the helmet and goggles, and he looked the part and everything else. And he had it figured very logically. He said, if you got a little four-place airplane like a Waco, he said, it burns 3.5 gallons an hour. It'll go 100 miles an hour. It's much cheaper, more practical. One of the things that became apparent once we started operating the little airplane was the way the coast would shrink. It made the whole coast of British Columbia seem small, and compared to the hours and hours and hours it would take me to go halfway up the coast with a boat, we'd be there in an hour and a half with the plane. Gave us a tremendous advantage over the Canadian Marconi Company, our competitors. As the war came to an end, everybody wanted to charter this airplane to take timber cruises up the coast, and there were hospital cases, ambulance trips, and all the rest of it. We became very busy. In those days, we had no radio in the aircraft, and we're not really established as an airline, so as to make do, places like Minstrel Island and Simoon Sound and Blind Channel, we made long arrows out of plywood, and if there was a passenger northbound or southbound, they would put this arrow out on the wharf. So we'd fly over, look for the arrow, if necessary land, pick up the passengers and go to Vancouver. That's before we had radio. Eventually, we got a contract license to fly for the Powell River Company, and we were getting big enough then, we called it Queen Charlotte Airlines. And that's where we bought the large aircraft, the Stranraers, and we could take 20 people from Vancouver to the Queen Charlotte Islands.
It was the worst place in the world to start an airline. The accident rate due to fog and bad weather and icing and all that kind of thing was greater than practically anywhere else on Earth.
We'd left Vancouver with all these luggage in the southeaster in terrible weather, and actually we were flying over Savory Island when my cousin, who was the pilot, said that none of the flight instruments were working, not one of them. Airspeed, rate of climb, nothing was working. And so they landed in the lee of Savory, in the calmer water there. And Hank Elwin, the engineer, went out on the wing, and he has to climb up a ladder to the upper where there was a pedo head. And somebody, make sure no dirt got in it, and pulled a French safe over this thing. So he climbed out there, pulled the French safe off it, and from then on everything functioned normally.
Spilsbury's Airline was kept continuously busy hauling in injured loggers and pioneers, people who'd suffered terrible accidents, living this very dangerous type of life that they lived in the logging and fishing and pioneering business.
There was a call came in when they were all having supper in a restaurant at Prince Rupert. A call came through on radio from Stewart that a child had an obstructed bowel or something or other and couldn't live the night without an operation. And our pilot up there decided he could fly up, get the mother and child, bring them down to the hospital, even though it meant flying after dark, which we were not licensed to do and he was not capable of doing safely. So the long and short of it was the aircraft was lost with all on board. I think there were 7 altogether, including the mother and child. And it hit the front pages of all newspapers in British Columbia. It was, gee, terrible. But it called so much attention to this upstart airline. We were just then calling ourselves Queen Charlotte Airline, with this big airplane, that the bookings went up and up and up. And it was publicity that did it. It had a very positive effect on our traffic bookings. In June of 1949, the Dominion Bureau of Statistics in Ottawa listed QCA as the 3rd largest airline in Canada, right after TransCanada Airlines and Canadian Pacific Airlines. I think at one time we had as many as 26 operational aircraft and about 300 employees.
Queen Charlotte Airlines simply reached a size. They were too successful. It became a target of the big players in the game from back east, and basically they thought that this little West Coast frog had grown too big for its pond, and they decided to pick it off, and that's what happened.
The money looked pretty good, because we kept holding off and we wouldn't sell, and finally we were offered, I think it was close to $2 million for the outfit, which was frankly more than it was worth. But I was outvoted, and I was very disappointed, and yet it's one of those happy accidents probably, because I don't think I would have stood up to it very much longer, the strain and so on, the responsibility. It was getting to me. I sort of relaxed and came back to the radio business, which was running very nicely at that time on its own, and thanks very much to my present wife, Wynne, who came up through the ranks for about 40 years and became factory manager. I had some wonderful, darn good engineers and darn good people.
It wasn't long before he'd taken Spilsbury and Tyndall and built it into Canada's largest exporter of radio telephone equipment.
In Labrador, there was no other form of communication except the radio telephone, and to some extent the Morse key. Morse key was totally in use until the Spilsbury radios arrived, and after that it became all radio telephone. And where all of the nursing stations had them on the coast, they had direct communication with the doctors back at the main hospital in St. Anthony or main hospital in Northwest River. And I would say those radios have saved countless lives, thousands of lives possibly.
Our portable two-way radios have been to the top of Mount Everest, and one of our sets accompanied the first solo expedition to the North Pole.
He was being sponsored by the National Geographic and also the Smithsonian Institute. And one morning they said to me, Naomi reached the North Pole at, let's say, 11:22 this morning. And he said, and I want to tell you something. We were never out of touch with him all the time. He said, that radio is phenomenal.
My years in radio communication were recognized with an award from the Federal Minister of Communications in 1988.
I'd like you to autograph a book for my husband's 50th birthday.
It's been a wonderful thing for British Columbia's rediscovery of this man, who at one time was a household word and a very important figure in BC Coast, but who for about 20 years or 30 years had been forgotten because time had gone by.
The coast has changed to the extent that where there used to be 1,400 people in Lochbury Inlet alone, I was up there this year and there are 4 people in Lochbury Inlet. The same thing up Blind Channel and other places where I go. Oh, it's still a lovely coast. I like it as much as ever. But a lot of the places that were populated and were quite important little spots on the coast have disappeared entirely. I've been asked, when am I going to write another book? But as I told somebody the other day, I'm looking forward to doing it in my old age. But right now I'm too busy.